This video is not about the Netflix show. Hello and welcome back to the Bird channel, where we talk about whatever I want, and I stream on twitch.tv/Jinzy. If you like this video, please leave a comment of some sort or all of my plans will be deceased by the end of this month. Disregard that they will be anyway. We're talking about The Sandman today, the comic book series, not the show, because the show isn't out yet, at least I hope it isn't by the time I upload this video. That'd be awkward. This topic was a request from the man who keeps pointing me towards interesting topics. I had never heard of The Sandman before picking up the topic for a video, and now I'm wondering why I hadn't. It's quite popular. Before I start talking about things in depth, here's a quick list of the comics I read before writing this video. There are a lot of spin-offs and side stories that pertain to other characters within the Sandman universe, but I found this list the most relevant for the topic. That does mean that for all of the above, there may be spoilers, although I will remain vague about any specifics. I will warn you before very important story spoilers, of course, but the Netflix show will be adapting the first 2 volumes, and I am going to talk you through the first volume in its entirety as an introduction in a very broad way. Although I should mention that I've seen the trailers for the series and they're definitely making some changes, so I'm sure you'll be alright either way. I'm really not going into details. If you want no spoilers at all for the Netflix show, I would not recommend watching this video right now. But do bookmark it for later because, please, I worked very hard on this. Thank you. Now, let us begin by talking about Volume 1 of the Sandman comics. Gather round the fire and let me tell you a tale. I see the comic as chiefly a book, walking territory touched on in places in Alan's stint on Swamp Thing. It would have superheroic elements, and it would be firmly rooted in fantasy, and it would be a horror title with a mature reader's tag. But I hope it would be the combination of horror, fantasy, superhero that would make it work. Perhaps the horror has the edge. After all, the tagline for the series is a line from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. I will show you terror in a handful of dust. June 6, 1916. Witchcross, England. A Mr. Roderick Burgess, magus of an order of ancient mysteries, gets his hands on the Magdalene grimoire. With it, he intends to summon and imprison Death herself so that none will ever die again. They fail and summon Dream instead, stealing his belongings, his mask, his sand pouch, and his gem. They imprison him there, hoping to barter for gifts from the Prince of Stories himself, but he remains silent. His containment here caused many to lose the ability to sleep at all, others sleep forever. The dream world is crumbling. November 1930. Ruthven Sykes, second in command of the Order of Ancient Mysteries, runs off with Ethel Cripps, Roderick's mistress. They take all 3 of Dream's items with them. December 1930. Roderick attempts to kill Sykes several times, but fails as Sykes trades away Dream's helmet to a demon in return for a magical amulet of protection. 1936. Ethel walks out on Sykes and takes the demon's amulet. Sykes dies at last. July 1939. Society is attempting to adjust to a life without sleep. Wesley Dodd becomes a Sandman Avenger. Unity Kincaid, asleep and unresponsive, is taken by someone and gives birth to a girl who is swiftly adopted out. 1947. Mr. Roderick Burgess dies. His epitaph reads, "Not dead, only sleeping." 1955. Alex Burgess has taken lead of the Order after his father's death. Dream remains silent. 1968. Alex refuses to let anyone sleep in the house for fear of empowering his silent guest. 1970. Alex relinquishes leadership to his personal assistant and lover, Paul Maguire, who doesn't believe in magic, but he does believe in money. Alex writes and studies Dream. 1982. Alex considers torturing Dream, but he has trouble convincing even himself that he could do so successfully. 1988. Alex curses Dream one final time, calling him nothing but a naked man in a glass box. In his careless rage, he breaks the magical circle that's held Dream captive for 72 years. Dream escapes. This is the point where we finally start following Dream himself. He returns to the world of dreams, searching for a dream to devour and regain some of his strength. He dreams up a new set of clothes and begins his search for the items he lost and revenge. People the world over finally begin to awaken. Alex, however, is sleeping. dreaming of Dream, who finally speaks to him. He introduces himself as the Lord of Dream and Nightmare, then asks for his tools, which Alex does not have. To repay his host for the years of imprisonment, Dream then grants Alex eternal waking. A cycle of fake awakenings, all ending in horror. His revenge costs Dream the rest of his energy, and making his way back to the dream world doesn't improve much. He eventually finds his pouch of sand through John Constantine. His helmet he wins back through a battle of wits from a demon in hell, and his gem is destroyed during a battle with the current owner, John D., also known as Dr. Destiny. And that is your full introduction to the Sandman and its main protagonist, Morpheus, more widely known as Dream of the Endless, a group of 7 individuals that represent several forces of nature, including death, desire, destruction, and, of course, Dream. Dream who fuels our imagination and thoughts which he can bend to his will as he pleases. Dream whose realm is the only one we readily visit during our mortal lives. The Dream Realm, a world just as real as ours, where he conjures both pleasant dreams and nightmares. After all, he knows us intimately, knows our stories and our greatest fears, and dreams can be most terrifying indeed. This comic does not pull any punches from the very start. If you were hoping for another colorful rendition of the Jolly Sandman who comes into your house to slap you into dreamland with his big bag of sand, this is not that. This comic has practically everything YouTube won't allow me to say, from taking the funny pills and powders to straight up torture. With that, I have to say that I did not actually enjoy this first arc because it made me incredibly sad. I had to read these first chapters in parts because every time I got past another corpse, I'd need a little sit down and a cup of tea and maybe a cat on my lap or something. It's bleak. Very bleak. We largely follow the misfortune of others. That's not to say there are no laughs at all, but they're more sensible chuckles than anything else. Curiously, Neil himself also felt like they were still finding their footing, so to speak, with this first installment. Most series and shows run into this problem. I'm going to bring up Star Trek again, but anyone who's seen the first season of The Next Generation knows what I'm talking about. Neil had set out to create an entirely new Sandman, after all. DC already had a Sandman otherwise, Wesley Dodds. Karen Berger, an editor for DC Comics, had spoken to Neil previously, and he'd mentioned then that he'd like to revive the Sandman. So, when she phoned him to ask if he'd be interested in a monthly magazine title, she reminded him of that conversation. But she wanted him to create a new character, someone no one's seen before. Thank you for that, Karen Berger. Very cool. So, Neil set to work on writing a draft proposal that included most of the elements that made it into the first issue. He had ideas for future stories too, one of them including a succubus brothel that sadly didn't make the cut. These first few stories did, however, include a lot of other DC characters. The Justice League, Wesley Dodds of course, and Constantine. The Sandman didn't quite stand on his own yet. Not until the final issue of this first arc. That one I really liked. It introduces Dream's older sister, Death. She finds Dream moping around and takes him on a walk to perk him up, as it were. And perk up he does, finding a new perspective on things. He's ready to embark on his own adventure that still include a lot of bleak things, but an equal amount of laughs and adventure. Neil ended his proposal with, "Okay, there. I hope you like it. I really do." And we did like it. The Sandman went on to become one of the biggest, most influential comic book series in the world. It even won the award for Best Short Fiction at the World Fantasy Convention. It was the first comic ever to do so. They immediately changed the rules for eligibility following that, so no comic book would ever win that award again. Which makes Neil's acceptance speech for this award particularly poignant. "Words are okay," he said. "They get Pulitzer Prizes. Pictures are okay. They hang in art galleries. But as soon as you put words and pictures together, people think it's for illiterates. There's a cultural prejudice against comics. A bit like how the Oscars give animated movies their own category because they don't see it as real art, and maybe that's why they're becoming irrelevant because some of the most beautiful art I've ever seen was an animated piece." Anyway, moving on. What's up, comic book person? Making a little kids thing with your kid tools again? Hey, film person, just writing a draft about the crushing weight of the unending cycle of life and death and a child coming to terms with the weight of their own mortality after— Yeah! Kid stuff. What's your latest movie about anyway? Someone who is sad? Also, based on a real story again? I can come up with my own stuff. Thank you. Yeah, based on a true story again. Only moving on a little bit though. We do need to mention the art here. We've had a short conversation about this on stream before, but I do feel like the art is half the experience. The Sandman also has an audiobook version. I have no doubt in my mind that it is fantastic in its own right, but there is a difference in description versus visualization. Successful books often get movie or show adaptations. Yes, The Sandman too. And generally speaking, those adaptations have to compromise. You can't do everything with special effects. That would get too expensive. And certain scenes are possible to describe, but not implement in general. It's why I can't help but roll my eyes when comics are viewed as childish. Because the beauty of these stories, of comics, is that they come with a visualization already. There is something to be said when it comes to imagination. Perhaps while listening to the audiobook, you imagined wild vistas and vibrant characters. At the same time, I'm very glad to see the visuals the creator had in mind in front of me. Not just because the art is beautiful, and it is. A myriad of different artists worked on this series, from inking to speech bubbles. They all have their own distinct style, and they somehow all fit the story incredibly well. But also because sometimes I would read a page and find myself stuck, staring at the images for a while before I moved on, because it told part of the story on its own. Dream's expressions, the background, sometimes the style itself would add so much that text alone would not be able to convey. You can say a room is confusing, describe how and why it is confusing, but seeing how confusing that room is another layer of story. Looking at this image conveys so much that if you were to put it into words, describe it all, it would only serve to create long lists of nothing but descriptions. One of the notes Neil left for the Overture comic was, "It's an eruption of madness, of lightning storms and burning. It's the end of the world and everything is sleeping and all dreams are on, and you get to draw this however you want." Overture is one of my favorite entries in the Sandman universe because of the art specifically. In it, Dream eventually meets with his father, Time. His realm is strangely flat and distorted. It's everywhere, all at once. The style is so different from the rest of the comic that you immediately wonder if they're even part of the same universe. It doesn't just tell a story, it also invokes an emotion. Confusion, curiosity. That's a lot harder to do through text, as you'd already have to describe this place as a different dimension altogether, where time has no meaning, or perhaps too much. Something else I've noticed that was perhaps intentional, perhaps not. At times, when Dream was shown, he would subtly change from panel to panel. His nose would be a little more slant, his chin more pointed. At first I thought it might just be the angle, or as with most art, slight discrepancies would pop up here and there, but I feel like they would have caught those. Instead, it made me think of dreams in general, in constant flux, just like Dream himself. Intentionally or otherwise, the art added yet another layer. All this to say, I very much enjoyed the art in The Sandman. Neil worked with many different artists for each issue, but one particular entry I do want to highlight, and that's The Dream Hunters. This is a separate short story about a lone monk and a fox. The fox once made a wager with a badger. Whoever could scare the monk out of his little temple would be allowed to keep the abode. Both creatures failed, but the fox had fallen in love with the monk. She stumbles upon some demons plotting the death of the monk, a death through dreams. The fox traverses the dreamlands to ask Dream for aid, which he grants. The fox would dream the monk's dreams and die in his stead. But when the monk found the little fox so near to death, he sought a way to help her, and eventually made it to Dream as well, asking for his aid. He granted it once more. The monk and the fox had a moment together, and then the monk was gone. Although he asked the fox not to take vengeance, she decided the Onmyoji, master of demons responsible for this whole ordeal, had to pay. As a fox demon, she was able to take the shape of a beautiful woman, and in this shape, she seduced him. Eventually, she convinced him to burn his home along with all his servants, his mistress, his wife, and his belongings. Then he gave up all his magic to the fox as well, only to have her bite out his eye and leave him broken. I tell you this story because I like it, but I also wanted to highlight the art. 2 versions of the Dream Hunters were created. One was not a comic, it was a short story with illustrations. Beautiful illustrations by none other than Yoshitaka Amano. Yes, the Yoshitaka Amano from the Final Fantasy art. I love his depiction of Dream more than any other. Most of Amano's art already seems vaguely dreamlike, so this was the perfect collaboration. Having said that, the second version of Dream Hunters was a comic adaptation. P. Craig Russell did the art for this version, and it's actually my favorite overall art style. I especially love the longer pages it opens with. If you're going to read any Sandman entries at all and have decided to watch this video without doing so, this standalone is a perfect start. It's not very long, it's very beautiful, and you need no prior knowledge to enjoy it. I only gave you a very brief overview of the story earlier, so don't let that deter you. But art isn't all the Sandman has to offer. The writing is also undeniably stellar. It took some time to find its footing, but once we make it to adventure territory, it becomes an ongoing mystery and a real page-turner. While each story stands on its own, you'll soon start to notice characters from previous arcs showing up here and there. By the end of the series, you realize that there had been one overarching story this whole time, although perhaps not really a story in the general sense. The story is that of Dream, Morpheus, and coming to terms with himself. So let's talk about Dream. Dream of the Endless, also known as Morpheus, Kaikul, Oneros, or, of course, the Sandman. He goes by many names because he has just as many appearances, all depending on who's watching. He's a complicated lad, and that's putting it mildly. He's the reason gods exist because he gives humanity dreams. He is their imagination, grants them stories. Over the course of the short stories, we get to know him better as a person and less as an entity to be feared. We still see him use his powers to exact revenge, teach lessons, or enact whatever plot he deems necessary. But when he returns to his castle in the Dreamlands, we see a much more vulnerable, much more confused Dream. Before others, he appears as haughty, overly sure of himself. He's got it all figured out, and you certainly wouldn't want to mess with him. As they say, he's far less charitable than his sister Death. But on his own, he doubts every action he takes. He questions his past actions, laments mistakes he's made. As one of the Endless, he is ancient, so he's made quite a few mistakes. Some of those mistakes we're privy to, the ones that matter for our particular story. For instance, there exists such a thing as a dream vortex in this universe. It manifests inside a person, and when that person dreams, they start to combine dreams around them into one gigantic dream. It turns both the vortex and the rest of their universe completely mad. A vortex needs to die immediately. Such a vortex manifested when Dream was much younger, but inexperienced as he was in such things, he couldn't push himself to kill the person at the center of it, until the madness had already infected everything and everyone around them. Now, instead of killing a singular person, Dream was forced to exterminate the entire system, but he still could not kill the system's son. He'd killed enough, he thought. That came back to bite him in the end during a story that took place before issue 1, Overture. During this story, that same son had gone utterly and completely mad, and it ended the entire universe. The only way Dream could prevent this from happening was by building something of a Noah's Ark, where 1,000 people of varying planets would dream about a different reality, thus dreaming it into existence. The trouble with Dream is he almost made the same mistake again years later. He found a vortex, found out who the vortex was, and still he lingered for a time. And I am about to spoil the very end of the Sandman comics. Warning you in advance. Giving you a minute. Right, he lingered long enough for this new vortex to affect several people, and this eventuality would, in the end, lead to Dream's death. These two particular arcs illustrate Dream's personality quite well, I think. Over the course of the 75 issues, he stumbles from problem to problem, always trying to solve them as best he can, but always making a mess of things in the end. He trusts Loki of the Norse mythology. He doesn't help his son Orpheus when he begs him for aid. He continues to ruin every single relationship he's ever been in. He tries so hard to figure himself out, but honestly, everyone else is doing a much better job at that than he is. Destruction, one of his brothers, describes Dream as a romantic fool, self-pitying but with a certain amount of personal charm. He also notes that he forgets nothing he has interest in, but forgets instantly things he does not care about. In most cases, Dream behaves aggressively true neutral. He's doing his job, following the rules. Mortals don't interest him, and while he's obviously meant to be somewhat mysterious, he's also, and I say this with love in my heart, a little shit. Dream has had multiple relationships throughout his existence, but his first love cheated on him, and ever since, his romantic escapades have all ended with Dream throwing a hissy fit. Nada, the most beautiful woman in the world, told him they couldn't be together because if they hooked up, the world would basically end. They hooked up anyway, and so the sun destroyed her entire kingdom in retaliation. In desperation, she threw herself off a cliff, and still Dream followed her into the netherworld, badgering her about becoming his queen. When she refused again, he sent her to hell for rejecting him. Calliope, the Greek muse of poetry, was married to Dream and had a child with him, Orpheus, but because Dream couldn't be bothered to help Orpheus, even though he very easily could have, the kid became an immortal disembodied head. When Calliope came knocking at Dream's door to talk, the guardians at the gate pretended not to know her. Because, and I must emphasize this once more, Dream is a little shit. And where do you think this avoidant behavior comes from?
I am the personification of a force of nature and have no idea how to deal with mortals.
I see, and why do you insist on getting involved with mortals?
I don't only get involved with mortals.
Just mostly.
Just mostly.
And what happens to those mortals?
Well, the first one cheated with the sun.
Right.
I sent another to hell before we started a relationship.
Of course.
And the last one broke up with me and it crushed me into a deafening abyss of sorrow.
As you do. And hearing this, would you not prefer to date immortals?
I was married to an immortal once, but then we had a son who became a disembodied head because I didn't want to parent him, and I pretended not to know my wife after that, so I like to think that counts as a divorce.
You know what? Stay single. And this is the crux of his predicament, really. Dream is so certain of himself in the moment, but when it comes down to it, when he starts to really look at his situation and himself, he always realizes that he's made mistakes. He has no idea how to fix them, though. He's not evil, just a very silly man stuck in his ways. When he does something, anything, out of the ordinary, it's usually because of other people. His sister Death eventually tells him that sending a potential lover to hell for not wanting to spend the rest of eternity with him was a little harsh. More precisely, she tells him that he acted appallingly and that Nada was right. Dream being with a mortal would have been disastrous. When Dream says he would have made her a goddess, Death answers that maybe she didn't want to be a goddess. Did he ever consider that? And Dream doesn't understand. He just doesn't see it. But he accepts that Death has a point, and so finally leaves to free Nada from hell. It will be dangerous, incredibly dangerous, he knows that. He makes preparations, feeling that perhaps he won't survive this trip. But he must go. Because while he's slow to see his errors, he tries to do the right thing to a fault. He really, truly tries. It's what makes him such a tragic idiot. In the Dream Hunters, everyone loses. The monk loses, the Onmyoji loses, the fox loses. Matthew, Dream's raven, asks what the point of it all was. what good did it do to help the fox if this was the outcome anyway? Dream answers that lessons were learned. Everyone learned a lesson. The last thing Matthew asks is, and did you also learn a lesson? But Dream does not answer his question. That is honestly the best representation of Dream I could find. No, he didn't learn a lesson. But he's not going to tell Matthew that. He has to protect his image as the mysterious dream of the endless. He tried, though. He tried very hard to learn a lesson. But Dream is old, set in his ways, and difficult to change, no matter how necessary that change is. He's stoic to the extreme, and he does not dance. During the Overture story, Delirium makes the poignant observation that Dream doesn't really care that the universe is ending, he just cares that it's his fault, and he does not want a pigable.
When we see Dream in his earliest form during the Conference of Stars in Endless Nights, he is quite incredibly different from his future self. He's happy, he smiles, he likes his sister-brother Desire. Dream had been lonely when one day he found Kilala of the Glow, a woman he fell in love with. He thought Desire had answered his loneliness with a companion. Of course, Kilala then cheats on him, and Desire laughs about it. Dream left that conference with, no doubt, a most acute sense of betrayal by two people he thought dear to him. Curious, also, is his hair in this comic. Note that at the start of the story, there are some white wisps running through his mane. It turns entirely black by the end of it. We'll get back to that. During most of Dream's adventures afterwards, he finds it impossible to ask for help, and when he does ask, he is often rebuked. This creature that personifies dreaming itself, stories, creativity, can you think of any one entity that would be more in its own head than this? Often when I lie awake at night, I ruminate on life, mistakes I have made or could make, scenarios that could play out, and the many variances of it. That's Dream, constantly ruminating. He reflects often, is unsure of himself even more often, and even as an all-powerful being, he is afraid, driven in equal measure by his responsibilities and his loneliness, his constant loneliness. When others see him as mean or disappointing, it genuinely hurts him. He cared deeply about all of his lovers, but they all feel he turns cold to them eventually. Because what's obvious and normal to Dream isn't always to everyone else. The bottom line really is that Dream is socially inept. When he got cheated on by Kilala, he had already begun to lose her. He took her to a conference of stars without explaining that these were celestial bodies, physically speaking to them. He didn't explain why they were there, who his family was. He didn't explain anything. For most of this story, she roams in confusion, constantly wondering what's going on and piecing it together slowly until she's simply told what's going on, and she loses her mind for a moment. Dream didn't realize what this knowledge meant to her, and he certainly didn't see the importance of breaking it to her gently. His sister Death is much better at that sort of thing, at least these days.
And we should talk about the side characters at least a little here. Dream is one of the 7 Endless. The Endless are the embodiments of several natural phenomena. The oldest is Destiny. Destiny leaves no footprints. He casts no shadow. He has a large book that tells him all that was and will be, and he does not seek to change any part of it. He only reads and bears witness, occasionally doing as the book says he should be doing. Next is Death. Death was there when the universe was born, and she will be the last to leave. When the universe itself dies, she's there when all souls die. Most importantly, she has a floppy hat collection. She's one of the most interesting characters to me because she's closest to Dream. She's there when you're born, and she's there when you die to take your soul onwards. In the past, she was cold and angry, but much changed, and now she's generally upbeat and caring. She cares not what you've done in the past, for she cares for all lives in equal measure. Once every 100 years, she walks the earth as a mortal for a day to see what she's missing and what it feels like to lose a life. This makes mortals a lot more relatable to her, and in that, she differs greatly from Dream. It may have helped in softening her demeanor over the years. She sees the point in those brief lives of mortals and in her own existence. Dream has trouble pinpointing that at times. The third oldest is Dream himself, and the fourth is Destruction. Destruction spends a great deal of time away from everyone else. In the first few issues, we're told one of the Endless had left, but we don't find out it's him until much later. He had decided that destruction would take place with or without him. Humanity would find a way. So he hung up his sword and left to sit on an island with his talking dog Barnabas so he could do art and cook food. He's cheerful and full of care and love, even more so than death. He's truly jolly.
And then there's desire and despair, two entities that go in tandem often. For desire breeds despair when unfulfilled. We don't see a great deal of despair. She is the second incarnation of her kind, and we have no idea what happened to the first. But as the name implies, she is often quite sorrowful. She misses Destruction most acutely because he was kind to her. Desire, however, meddles in absolutely everything. They refer to desire as it, sibling or sister-brother, for desire is entirely gender fluid. They appear in whatever form is most attractive to those watching. And desire, like Dream, often gives off an aura of loneliness. Both deal in the realm of emotion, of fantasy. Perhaps that's why desire takes any and all opportunities to mess with Dream. But they also care about Dream without wanting to say that they do. Once, when Dream was much younger, he lost his realm to two gods. He asked his siblings for help, but none aided him save Desire, who sent him a lover who also knew how to fight. In Overture, when Dream tries to fix his universe-ending mistake, Desire actually joins him on his journey, disguised as an alternate version of Dream, a large cat. They are again the only one of the Endless to directly help Dream. And they are also the one to start the eventual chain of events that spells the end for Dream.
Finally, we have Delirium, who was once Delight. Dream and Delirium's relationship is odd at the best of times. It's their relationship that I found the most fun, because things are never dull around Delirium. There's a point in the story where Dream and Delirium travel together in an effort to find destruction. It's a very sweet story and also the most lighthearted, the one I found the most genuine joy in reading. I couldn't help but smile. Coincidentally, Delirium also makes Dream smile, something quite rare, though she was scared of him for some time due to his cold demeanor. Like Dream, all of the Endless tend to take on a form that is most suitable for the situation, depending on who they're talking to. If they're in Squirrel Land, they're all squirrels. But Delirium is always exceptionally herself, still ever-changing but not subtly like Dream. She shifts in wild bursts. Nothing about her is quiet, save when she feels abandoned. The stories that involve the Endless themselves are, in general, my favorite kind. Watching them bounce off each other and figuring out their relationships is fun. And it's not just the Endless. There are plenty of other interesting side characters, each with their own very distinct personality and background.
I also appreciate that not everything gets explained. If it isn't natural to talk about something at length, the comic generally doesn't. And sometimes mysteries are mentioned but never revealed. Something nasty lives in the basement of Abel and Cain's house. But that's all we hear about it. What that nasty thing is? No one knows. It's just there, mentioned sporadically. Several characters are introduced that live extremely long lives. When one of them dies, his son finds all sorts of items in his study that are, once again, not explained. The man just had secrets. We don't get to know everything about Dream either before he dies. We can infer a great deal of things, but the story relies a lot on the reader getting to know Dream as an individual. What would he be thinking? His death is both strangely sudden and expected. By the end of the series, Dream is dead and reborn once again. Dream, Morpheus, is tremendously stuck in a prison of his own making. The bars are made of his pride and rules. Once when he broke the rules that resulted in the literal destruction of existence itself. So now he doesn't do it anymore. That mistake stemmed more from his lack of understanding, however. He didn't realize what breaking the rules meant, why that rule existed. Now he still largely doesn't, but instead of letting his emotions interfere, he blindly follows the rules, practical or not. Partially out of fear, partially because he now believes it to be right. That doesn't mean he'll make no mistakes. As said, he makes mistakes throughout the series constantly. But he seems to be making the same mistakes over and over. He's overconfident, doesn't share his problems with others, instead choosing to solve things himself to the detriment of all else, and he most certainly believes that change is impossible. And perhaps for him, it is. Imagine that it's difficult to change for a human being, set in their ways. Things that you felt were true for decades now turned on its head. Now try to imagine what that's like for an ageless entity. You can't imagine. It's unimaginable. So instead of changing, he chooses death. The Furies have come to take his life for his past mistakes, one in particular. He could break the rules to survive, certainly, but he doesn't. He summons his sister, Death, and they can talk in peace side by side. Death tells him, the only reason you've got yourself into this mess is because this is where you wanted to be. Dream could have left, like Destruction did. He could have killed a woman to save his own hide. But that would go against his nature, so instead, he'd made preparations. He'd known for a time now where this path would lead. As Death tells it, he knew what he was doing. He just didn't let himself know that he was doing it, orchestrating his own demise.
Death took his life, and as she did, a new dream was reincarnated. One Morpheus had given all of his memories, all of himself. Daniel. He was not Morpheus, but he was Dream of the Endless. Instead of Morpheus' black hair and attire, Daniel was pure white, and he was kind. He was warm. Where Morpheus would never pet his guardians, Daniel did. It was said that nothing ever touched Morpheus unless he wished it. And he does not touch things or people except with a purpose. Daniel was what Morpheus was trying so hard to become, in a sense, without success. Neil reiterates several times throughout several notes that Daniel is still Dream of the Endless. Daniel himself notes that he has not yet earned the titles of the previous dream, of Morpheus. He's a new beginning. The ending of the series denotes change. Throughout the entire story, Dream really does not change when others tell him that he must. When Neil Gaiman was asked to tell the story of the Sandman in 25 words or less, he answered, "The Lord of Dreams learns that one must change or die," and makes his decision.
When Morpheus died, I cried. I sat there reading the comic and I cried. I kept reading and kept crying, and the art style used in the comic that shows us the mourning of Morpheus now makes me irrevocably sad. When all was said and done, I was left staring at my screen for a while and then made a collage of mostly dream and some death, trying very much to work through my emotions, so to speak. And then I went to bed, until I stopped doing that because I was still thinking about the Sandman. I got up, sat down on the living room couch, and started recording on my phone in a whisper so as not to wake the neighbors. And then I cried some more during that recording, trying out loud to figure out why I cared so much about this fictional character that I couldn't sleep and instead sat crying on the couch in complete darkness. Because the dream I'd gone on this rather long journey with was dead. And I didn't take that very well. But I did come to a few conclusions. The first one being, I know Dream better than I know basically any of my friends. When we meet people, we get a name and maybe some small talk. What do you do for a living? What are your hobbies? At least those are the questions people ask at the standing around with a glass in your hand pretending to enjoy yourself type of events. Something my mother affectionately called glass standing. Once you're actually friends, you get to know them a little better. They might confide in you from time to time about things that worry them, things that bother them, a few of their hopes and dreams for the future. But even then, you're not in their head. You don't follow them around to watch them make mistakes or achieve whatever success they might have. But we are quite literally in the heads of our fictional characters. The authors of a story ensure that they make note of any and all important emotions and thoughts relevant to the character. In the case of a comic that can extend to expressions and movements, they tell us everything.
We know very well what Morpheus worries about, and we can follow his mistakes step by step. We can even see him realize that he's made mistakes in the first place. It begins all the way back in Overture. He doesn't heed the advice to be cautious when traveling back home, so he gets captured. While he gets captured, Desire assaults Unity Kincaid. Unity gives birth to Rose Walker, who becomes another dream vortex. Dream doesn't stop her quickly enough, so she destroys a marriage and a dream world from a neighbor. That neighbor eventually travels back to her dream world where she summons Dream, who meets his next lover there. That lover breaks his heart, causing Dream to go on a journey with Delirium to find Destruction, who he only finds because he finally kills his son Orpheus, and killing his son is what allows the Furies to justify hunting him down, leading to his death. And all throughout that domino effect of an existence, Dream makes mistakes that we can all readily see are mistakes, even without seeing the consequences. He trusts Loki's word. He's callous to his son. Dream, this all-powerful being, is a mess. He makes an absolutely horrendous amount of mistakes. And that's my second point, actually.
Beyond just getting to know Dream intimately, we see every single one of his mistakes. Do you ever hit up your friends with a, "Hey, I made some disastrous decisions in the past, let me tell you about some of them, they're pretty bad"? Of course not. We all mess up from time to time, but especially in the age of social media, I'm sorry I had to bring that up, it's easy to feel like we're the only one. Aside from the massive scandals, most people post about the cool stuff they're doing. Maybe they'll complain about general things every so often, or about trouble they're in, but they're not going to post about mistakes just because. I was a terrible father and caused my son's eternal suffering until I gutted his disembodied head that one time isn't a tweet you'll see often. There's anonymous Reddit threads that let people vent about these sorts of things, but who knows which are real and which are not? But Morpheus, fictional characters in general, we see their mistakes in real time. This smart, interesting hero who seems so cool and collected is making mistake after mistake. It makes them instantly more relatable. All of Morpheus' relationships end in tragedy. He's bad at all the same things a lot of us are bad at. He has power, but he's not remotely infallible.
Juxtaposed with his siblings, it's even more apparent. We don't follow the rest of the Endless quite as closely as we do Dream. We know that Despair quite sincerely despairs at times and that she misses her brother. That's it. Destruction left and seems quite happy. Destiny just is. Delirium's problems seem largely attached to her personality, and you can barely call her actions mistakes. Desire is the only one we see fail at times, but they're more fun little plots they've set up for laughs, though they seem lonely. Death is the only other person we get a little more information about, and even then, the only time we see her truly make something close to a mistake is in the side stories. She loses her Ankh, the symbol of her power, once, but then she just buys another one and nothing else happens. That stolen Ankh might well come back to haunt her eventually, but because we don't follow her quite as closely as we have Dream, we don't get to know that. Because of it, she seems more distant, untouchable than Dream. Her mistakes are not quite as earth-shattering.
Death is also the one who gave Orpheus, Dream's son, the immortality that would eventually become his prison. So she did, in fact, have a hand in Dream's eventual death. She could not have known in the past, but we also don't get to see her reaction to that knowledge if she ever found out. If the story of the Sandman had focused more heavily on death over Dream, I've no doubt that this would have called for some devastating scenes. She helped cause her brother's death. As it stands, we only get what we need from the side characters to advance Dream's story. We see his inner monologue, his moments alone where he openly despairs, but only to us, the reader, as if to say that he trusts us with his vulnerability over his family. And that's not to say that Dream is a perfect individual who simply
falls victim to all the bad things in the world. As said, he did some pretty radical things himself that can't really be described as good. But, and this is my third point, we see things from his perspective. We don't have to ask him why he did something, we already know. We were there. He thought about it with us in his head to listen along. We sympathize because he is often the only perspective we get, perhaps thinking a little more critically when another character voices their concerns about the bad things our character has done. But we don't have to like the fictional characters we enjoy or attach ourselves to in any way. We just have to know them. We have a tendency to sympathize with those whose story we follow more easily. Their story is our story. So I cried for Dream. A week later, I still got sad thinking about it, and then I reread the entire series again. I was still sad by the end, but I didn't hate Daniel anymore. Because I did when I first finished reading. Daniel existing was the reason the Furies were called into action, and then this same Daniel replaced Morpheus, a character I loved so much? How dare he? This false dream! If that sounds a little irrational, then that's a fair assessment. Getting this affected by a story does require a certain willingness to invest, and I do love a good story, so Daniel felt like a betrayer, a pretender.
By this time, however, I'd also read The Absolute Sandman, generously lent to me by Robertson. Thank you, Robertson. So I'd read Neil's thoughts on several stories as well. At the time, he didn't really want to start the final Sandman chapter either. Writing it scared him. Morbidly, he found himself thinking fondly of train wrecks and crashing. If he died suddenly, he wouldn't have to write an ending, and we could all imagine our ideal ending. When he eventually got around to writing the final issues anyway, he knew it would end in tragedy. But a tragedy that ended on a hopeful note. That's what Daniel is. Morpheus is gone, but just one version of him. Daniel is Dream, but a different perspective of him. Earlier, I mentioned Dream's hair in what is, as far as we know, the first story we have of them. He enters that story with several wisps of white streaking his hair, happy in his newfound relationship, happy to leave some of his loneliness behind. He leaves with pure black hair after his first love embraces another partner and his sibling openly mocks the situation. He leaves a few hopeful streaks of white hair less.
Daniel's hair is entirely white. He's Dream, but a truly hopeful Dream. He has all of Morpheus' memories, and with it all the lessons he refused to learn. I don't hate Daniel anymore, although I still miss his moody predecessor. Because a story like this doesn't just have characters. The characters are the story. A series like The Witcher, because of course I found a way to bring The Witcher up anyway, focuses on the story itself. The quest to find Ciri. During that story, we see the characters change, we learn more about them, but in the end, the story is done when the quest is over. The Sandman didn't really have one story. That would have been strange. He is the prince of stories after all. In The Sandman, the quest revolves around the character of Dream changing. Dream is the story. The story ends when he does. So this was the perfect finale. A literal new chapter. So why do we love fictional characters so much? Because they become our best friends or our worst enemies. Either way, we get to know them intimately in a way we will never know anyone in the real world. They trust us implicitly with their darkest secrets and their greatest dreams. We know what they'd like to say but don't. One-sided as it is, we make a connection and get invested in their lives, especially when we see parts of ourselves in them. This is why comfort characters exist, and Dream became one of mine. I found it very difficult to say anything succinct about the Sandman, hence why this video is very long once again, but I also wasn't quite sure what part of the Sandman I wanted to talk about, because there's so much to say about it that very often my thoughts turned into complete word salad. The only thing I knew was that I wanted to talk about Dream himself, and I wanted the people watching to understand why he and his story were so wonderfully interesting to me. It's always bothered me that comics aren't taken quite as seriously as many other art forms. Again, much like animated movies and shows. The Sandman gathered serious accolades, but the moment it did, it caused an immediate stir. Comics are for children, animation is for kids. I wanted to talk about that, but I hope, that in this video I've managed to explain why the Sandman is important and impactful to me. And if something is important and impactful, isn't that art? If something moves you, isn't that enough? Do adults not want to be emotionally invested because the art includes superheroes or characters other than humans? The fact that the term Oscar bait exists at all should tell the adults in the room that perhaps their idea of what is and isn't art has become incredibly artificial, and there's a reason no one cares about the Oscars anymore. The Sandman didn't try to pander to anyone. Neil Gaiman wrote a story that he found interesting to share. The many artists responsible for bringing that story to life, visually, did so because they loved the project. And it's very, very beautiful art that many of us appreciate tremendously. Thank you for making that phone call all those years ago, Karen Berger. Until another tale finds us.